Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to welcome you for this special lecture about one of our most controversially discussed themes in our society. There is hardly a topic which triggers more emotions than the climate discussion, may be comparable with the nuclear energy debate over the last 30 or 40 years, or actually with the discussion how many immigrants can be taken in and integrated in our country. There is also hardly a scientific topic which is stronger influenced by politics and governmental funding than climate research. And the other way around, we have climate institutions consulting our government, which request a great transformation in our society. So our Scientific Advisory Board for Global Environmental Changes. From these experts, we hear climate sciences are well settled. And for them, it is absolutely clear that exclusively humans with their fossil fuel emissions are responsible for any global warming. If this is really so clear, and if the observed increase of atmospheric CO2 is only man-made, this we will hear in this lecture, which will be given by Professor Murry Salby, and it is our great pleasure to have you here today in Hamburg. This for this talk and for an exciting exchange about some additional and actual questions. Your lecture even motivated climate experts from Norway to meet you here. Therefore, a very warm welcome to Professor Jan Erik Solheim from Oslo. Also a very warm welcome to the Vice President of the European Institute of Climate and Energy, Michael Limburg, and to Professor Fahrenholt, well known as former Senator for Environment in Hamburg and co-author of the bestseller Die Kalte Sonne. With Professor Salby, we have one of the few internationally renowned experts in atmospheric physics and climate sciences, who was extensively studying the main processes controlling the Earth's atmosphere system. Before he accepted the chair for climate science at Macquarie University in Sydney, he was director of the Center for Atmospheric Theory and Analysis in Colorado and professor of the Department of Atmospheric and Oceanic Sciences of the University of Colorado. He organized many international conferences and symposia. He published hundreds of papers in well-known international journals about the dynamic processes in the atmosphere, about satellite observations, the ozone layer, and the greenhouse gases. In his latest textbook from 2012, which is meanwhile a classic, Professor Salby develops the basic atmospheric processes from first principles, and everyone who wants to understand how climate works and who wants to do research on this important and still open questions in this discipline should study this book. Then less unqualified or even erroneous air and papers about the climate change would have been published. Concerning the still open questions, I would like to cite the former director of the Max Planck Institute for Meteorology here in Hamburg, Professor Leonard Bengtsson, who said, "A field which is still so incompletely understood, like the climate science, can only profit from the input, the ideas and methods of other disciplines." I can say that for me, having done some research in atmospheric spectroscopy, this was also motivation enough to look a bit closer to the real influence of greenhouse gases on our climate. And Bengtsson also said that it is essential to live in a society where a consensus, particularly in this field, is not compulsory. A real important and sapient comment, but sometimes reality develops quite different. We only have to remember what happened to our today's speaker 5 years ago. You all know about this, but I have to mention this again. He was on a Europe tour and was giving talks in Vienna, in Paris, in Cambridge, London, Oslo, and also here in Hamburg. A bit later also at Westminster for the United Kingdom Parliament and in Edinburgh for the Scottish Parliament. He was presenting new results about the relationship between greenhouse gases and global temperature. However, a serious drawback was that with his studies he came to different conclusions than the IPCC. And he was so fearless to present these results on his tour. His university in Sydney didn't like this and simply cancelled his flight from Paris back to Australia. And with the further consequences that he was released from his university duties and no longer allowed to enter his office or to have any access to his own computer files. Absolutely unbelievable how freedom in teaching and research is undermined in some countries. But not only in Australia. Unfortunately, also here we have more and more difficulties in presenting our results or our interpretations on conferences, as invited talks, or as lectures in our universities, when they are expected to deviate from the mainstream. Apparently, also our academic institutions have medial outreach is more important than the genuine responsibility to critically scrutinize controversial assumptions and theories. Meanwhile, our academic system is well controlled by several forms of censorship in journals or research applications by respective reviewers who reject articles and applications, and also by attacking or suppressing events which deviate from the party line. This meeting, where Professor Salby can present his latest studies about the climate cycle, and studies he luckily continued after he was dismissed from Macquarie University. The key question of his presentation today is, what is really behind the increase of atmospheric CO2? We are very excited to listen to your new results.
Thank you, Professor Hardy. It's a pleasure to return to Helmut Schmidt University, especially, I hope, to an institution that still teaches students the importance of critical thinking. The theme of today's lecture is carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's the gateway to projected changes of climate. But even more fundamental is an underlying theme. This is a story about truth. Why we pursue it, and how eventually it is found. History has shown repeatedly that where it's not found is in the den of vested interests. The popularized view of CO2 has been promoted in significant part by news media and Hollywood. These days, there's not a lot of difference. The premise for the proclaimed changes is increasing atmospheric CO2. The argument goes like this. Increasing atmospheric CO2 follows from human emission. It increases global mean temperature, which allegedly then cascades to all manner of climate impacts. More drought, more floods, less snow, more snow, and countless other claimed consequences. The catalyst of these proclaimed changes is increasing atmospheric CO2. Therefore, you'd better have a pretty good handle on it, conceptually and quantitatively. If you don't, everything else is nonsense. Today, we'll first consider the evidence of its seminal impact, changes of global mean temperature. We'll then review the tenets of human-induced climate change and how they stand up against observed behavior. I'll turn next to recent changes of human emission and the response of atmospheric CO2. We'll close with a retrospective on the institutionalized treatment of climate, whether it's science or ideology. The seminal feature of climate change is global mean temperature, which we're told by the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, is systematically increasing. The premise for this claim is the surface record. But is this a record of global mean temperature? The surface record is derived from the surface network of thermometers, which is concentrated over land masses, populated land masses. It represents about 20% of the Earth's surface. The remaining 80% is largely unobserved. The limited sampling is addressed through processing by humans. The surface record is thus not a record of observed global mean temperature, but a proxy for it. Even where surface measurements are available, their location near population centers makes them inextricably biased by urban development, which skews temperatures to warmer values. It also makes them unrepresentative of 80% of the Earth. Evaluating changes over the 20th century is even more difficult. If observations are limited to sites that operated over most of the 20th century, the surface network reduces to this. The mean over these sites is little more than U.S. temperature, which is controlled not by global energetics, but by neighboring ocean. Moreover, these sites underwent major urbanization during the 20th century. To account for these limitations, the observed records are subjected to processing. The resulting proxy has been revised repeatedly. Subsequent manipulations to make it new and improved. What changes in these revisions is not the observations. They can't be reproduced. What changes is their interpretation. Its impact is transformative. In blue is the mean of U.S. measurements, all that's available to infer global mean temperature across the 20th century. It exhibits little, if any, systematic change. Processing yields the record in red. What's reported by the responsible government agency. The difference is what's introduced by processing. So you see, there really is human-induced warming. It's just not induced in the atmosphere. Because inferring global mean temperature requires interpretation, the surface proxy will always be vulnerable to manipulation. There's only one record of observed global mean temperature. Satellite observations provide nearly global coverage that's unbiased by urban development. Spanning 4 decades, the satellite record exhibits little systematic change. Since the 1996 El Nino, global mean temperature has hovered about a constant value. The so-called pause in global warming. In truth, the term pause is a misnomer. There was nothing to pause. Before 1996, global temperature likewise hovered about a constant value, separated from later values by a brief step in temperature. There's no evidence of a systematic trend in temperature. The surface record, unlike the satellite record, which is clouded by ambiguity, is relied upon for claims of global warming. If that proxy record, which has been subjected to repeated manipulation, turns out to have no systematic trend, we won't have to worry about the real record. For a trend to be scientifically meaningful, it requires the following. 1. Temperatures at the end of the record are offset relative to those at the beginning of the record. They are. 2. The offset followed from systematic changes during preceding years, perhaps obscured by random changes. Equivalently, the offset cannot be eliminated by minor perturbation of the record. For example, by eliminating a small subset. As in the satellite record, the surface record exhibits a plateau in the last 2 decades. Higher temperatures at the end of the record followed from a brief period of warming during the late 90s. Only 4 years. Without warming during those 4 years, the recent offset vanishes. What remains is slightly warmer than the middle of the century. That offset likewise followed from a brief period of warming. This one during the late 70s. Again, only 4 years. Without that brief period of warming, the temperature record is flat for the last 70 years. The offset did not follow from systematic warming. we can evaluate the probability of such an offset occurring from random heating and cooling. The temperature offset equals the cumulative warming over the last 70 years. That can be expressed in terms of the probability of instantaneous warming or cooling of particular magnitude. It, in turn, is proportional to the expected value of instantaneous warming. The expected value represents the systematic drift of temperature, the apparent trend. To discriminate the average conditions at the beginning and end of the 70 years, the records are low-pass filtered. For the full record, inclusive of temperature offset, the probability density has non-zero expected warming. It corresponds to the observed offset of 0.6 degrees. For the perturbed record, exclusive of temperature offset, the probability density has zero expected warming. For the observed offset to be distinguishable from one that's produced by random warming and cooling, the probability of warming or cooling equal to or greater than what's observed must be smaller than 5%. It isn't even close. By a scientific standard, the much brandished trend in global temperature is unworthy of discussion. Oh, it's good for headlines. It just has little physical basis. We'll soon see the origin of those headlines. Consequences. With virtual certainty, slightly warmer global temperature today did not result from systematic warming during preceding years, but from random episodes of warming and cooling. The responsible episodes of warming and cooling are independent of one another and of time. It follows that they, and the slightly warmer temperature they produced, are independent of any property that increases systematically. The foundation of anthropogenic climate change is increasing atmospheric CO2, which allegedly is caused by human emission. This assessment was mandated by UN bureaucrats in their Framework Convention on Climate Change. It relies upon three fundamental tenets. Tenet 1. Isotopic changes of atmospheric CO2, like changes of carbon-13, are the signature of human emission. These are ice core records of CO2 and carbon-13. While CO2 increased over the 20th century, carbon-13 decreased. On centennial timescales, changes of CO2 and carbon-13 are out of phase. This is allegedly a unique signature of fossil fuel emission. Well, no. We've previously shown that the same changes are inherent to natural emission. This is the more recent observed record of net CO2 emission, natural plus human. It undergoes large interannual excursions by as much as 100%. They cannot follow from fossil fuel emission, which vary gradually through the period. They represent changes of natural emission. Superimposed is the record of carbon-13 emission. As on centennial timescales, these natural changes of CO2 and carbon-13 are also out of phase. Tenet 2. Past changes in the ice proxy of CO2 equal CO2 that was in the ancient atmosphere. Well, no. We've previously shown that non-conservative effects associated with glacial ice and its extraction introduce large discrepancies from CO2 that was in the atmosphere. When those effects are accounted for, CO2 changes that occurred in the atmosphere are underestimated by CO2 changes in the ice proxy across a wide range of timescales. Other errors in the ice proxy will be considered shortly. Tenet 3. Natural processes are a net sink of atmospheric CO2. The argument goes like this. The budget of atmospheric CO2 can be rearranged into the following form, where the left-hand side, natural emission and absorption, is entirely natural. The right-hand side follows from the change of observed CO2, which is only half as large as anthropogenic emission. Consequently, natural processes represent a net sink of atmospheric CO2. Therefore, it's argued, increasing CO2 positively, absolutely has to be caused by human emission. Well, no. That argument is like so much of what is proclaimed on this subject, naive. Atmospheric CO2 is governed by the conservation law. The difference between emission and absorption on the left-hand side represents net emission, the component of emission not offset by absorption. Net emission equals the rate at which CO2 increases. In the absence of extraneous emission, the atmosphere experiences only natural emission and the absorption it induces. Their difference is net natural emission, which in the conservation law forces an increase in the natural component of CO2. The atmosphere is now perturbed by anthropogenic emission. and the absorption it induces. Their difference is net anthropogenic emission. The conservation law is then likewise perturbed. Now involving net natural emission and net anthropogenic emission, which jointly represent total net emission. They force an increase in total CO2. During the satellite era, anthropogenic emission increased systematically by 65%. Total net emission from both components is observed. It underwent large interannual excursions, but little, if any, systematic change. The observed evolution tracks surface conditions, mostly temperature, which regulates natural emission and absorption. Total net emission, once observed, is intrinsically sensitive to temperature. Even a minor increase of temperature induces a major increase of net emission. It's noteworthy that methane obeys the same relationship to temperature. Anthropogenic emission, on the other hand, is independent of temperature. The observed record shows that to leading order, total net emission is a function of only temperature, despite a 60% increase in anthropogenic emission. There's only one way this can happen. Net anthropogenic emission was much smaller than net natural emission. It can be shown that anthropogenic emission must therefore experience a strong offset from absorption it induces. When the conservation law is rearranged with natural components on one side, it contains a strong cancellation between anthropogenic emission and anthropogenic absorption. It then reduces to a form largely independent of anthropogenic emission. CO2 is thus controlled by net natural emission. What is the origin of the observed temperature dependence of CO2 emission? Plotted here is local emission and absorption over ocean. These values are mostly modeled because actual measurements of CO2 flux are rare. Notice, almost nowhere is the ocean in equilibrium with the atmosphere. CO2 is emitted in the tropics and absorbed at high latitude. Net global emission is therefore a small residual of opposing contributions. For this reason, a small perturbation of local values can yield a substantial change in net emission. A site in the North Atlantic corresponds to absorption of CO2. Absorption there depends on temperature. inversely. For each degree of temperature increase, absorption is reduced by 16%. That's equivalent to a 16% increase in emission. The dependence on temperature is even greater over land, where soil respiration contributes to global emission. For each degree of temperature increase, it increases by 33%. These observed contradictions to the tenets of anthropogenic climate change reflect a principle that's integral to science. We can't prove anything. We can only disprove something. Feynman, considered the greatest mind since Einstein, also recognized the consequence of this principle. Eventually, the truth will out. This recognition dates back to the dawn of the Age of Enlightenment, to the father of the modern scientific method. Truth is the daughter of time. Not authority. For atmospheric CO2, the premise of anthropogenic climate change, that time has arrived. Fossil fuel emission has now undergone substantial changes. Those changes can be compared to the response of atmospheric CO2. During the decade after the turn of the century, fossil fuel emission increased 3 times faster than it did during the preceding decade. Cumulative anthropogenic emission must obey the conservation law. For CO2 to increase, it must therefore have 2 components. A component equal to absorption of CO2, which offsets its removal. It's the compensated component of anthropogenic emission, plus additional emission equal to the increase of anthropogenic CO2. It's the non-compensated component. This component of anthropogenic emission is equivalent to net anthropogenic emission. It can be shown that for steadily increasing emission, absorption lags emission by about an absorption time. Otherwise, CO2 would not increase. For a given absorption time, this determines the compensated component of emission. The part canceled by absorption. That, in turn, determines the non-compensated component, the part responsible for increasing CO2. Shaded is the cumulative non-compensated emission. For an absorption time of 5 years, a value implied by the IPCC's own estimate of absorption. It represents the additional CO2 that was emitted by humans, beyond that necessary to maintain existing CO2 against absorption. Additional emission in the second decade was 3 times that in the first decade. The increase of anthropogenic CO2 during the second decade must therefore be 3 times as large as during the first decade. Plotted below is the observed record of total atmospheric CO2, anthropogenic plus natural. It increased almost linearly, with no change in growth. Consequently, the increase in the second decade was almost identical to the increase in the first decade. This inconsistency can occur only if the increase of anthropogenic CO2 was much smaller than the increase of natural CO2. A change in the growth of anthropogenic emission must change the growth of anthropogenic CO2. It can be compared against the observed growth of total atmospheric CO2. After 2000, steady growth of anthropogenic emission plateaued in 2011, after which it changed little. The disparate growth of anthropogenic emission during these 2 decades requires different growth of anthropogenic CO2. In the observed record of total CO2, a change of growth is not evident. CO2 increased steadily across the 2 decades at a nearly constant rate. Away from the 2016 El Nino, deviations from linear growth are minuscule, smaller than 1 ppmv. The growth of anthropogenic CO2 is controlled by 2 opposing influences in the conservation law. Anthropogenic emission, which forces CO2 growth, and the absorption time, which opposes it. It can be shown that the time for CO2 growth to respond to the change of emission after 2011 is an absorption time. For long absorption time, anthropogenic CO2 will continue to grow through accumulation in the atmosphere. For short absorption time, it will equilibrate to the nearly constant emission after 2011. Integrating the conservation law provides a family of CO2 evolutions, each one corresponding to a different absorption time. For an absorption time of 50 years, half a century, comparable to what's relied upon by the IPCC, growth of anthropogenic CO2 continues to accelerate in the second decade, even though anthropogenic emission then had plateaued. Consequently, anthropogenic CO2 diverges noticeably from linear growth by 12 ppmv. An absorption time of 5 years is an order of magnitude shorter than what's relied upon by the IPCC. growth of anthropogenic CO2 then begins to level off in the second decade. But it still diverges from linear growth by more than 5 ppmv. For an absorption time of 1 year, divergence from linear growth becomes smaller than 1 ppmv. However, these conditions yield mean anthropogenic CO2 of only 3 ppmv. The anthropogenic fraction of increased CO2 is then of order 3%. If you've followed previous analysis that I've presented, which are independent of this analysis, this number should look familiar. Even more noticeable is the difference of net emission. During the 2 decades, anthropogenic emission increased by more than 50%. Net emission, the total actually observed, underwent little, if any, systematic change. With interannual excursions filtered out, it deviates by less than 6%, even inclusive of a residual of the 2016 El Nino. The inconsistency can occur only if net anthropogenic emission was much smaller than net natural emission. For an absorption time of 50 years, net anthropogenic emission increases systematically by 0.85 ppmv per year. Total net emission, what's observed, deviates by less than 0.2 ppmv per year, even inclusive of the residual of the El Nino. For an absorption time of 5 years, net anthropogenic emission still deviates by 0.3 ppmv per year. For an absorption time of 1 year, net anthropogenic emission deviates by less than 0.2 ppmv per year. Net anthropogenic emission is then about 0.1 ppmv per year. Total net emission, what's actually observed, exceeds 2.1 ppmv per year. The anthropogenic fraction of net emission is then smaller than 5%. In light of these contradictions to the promoted view of CO2, it's appropriate to reflect on the historical treatment of this subject. Parties who have been institutionalized have become less able to think and act independently because of having lived under the rules of an institution. Feynman had a term for this phenomenon: cult science. The mandate of climate change by UN bureaucrats opened the floodgates to public resources. It spawned countless claims and predictions by parties who promptly became government experts. Those claims which can be tested have now amassed a lengthy record of failure. This should hardly come as a surprise. Historical treatment of this subject is soft science, a branch of geography concerned with cataloging and comparing natural features, like tree rings, sediments, and fossilized remains. Features whose representation of atmospheric behavior is fuzzy, if not dubious. Absent is the rigor that's necessary for understanding, because those descriptive treatments lack physical laws that unambiguously govern the behavior. But don't take my word for it.
Because of the success of science, there is a kind of I think a kind of pseudoscience that social science is an example of a science which is not a science. They don't do scientific. They follow the forms. You gather data, you do so and so forth, but they don't get any laws. Haven't found out anything. But what happens is, at an even more mundane level, we get experts on everything that sound like they're sort of scientific expert. They're not scientific. They sit at a typewriter and they make up something like, food grown with fertilizer that's organic is better for you than food grown with fertilizer that's inorganic. May be true, may not be true, but it hasn't been demonstrated one way or the other. But they'll sit there on the typewriter and make up all this stuff as if it's science, and then become an expert on foods, organic foods, and so on. There's all kinds of myths and pseudoscience all over the place. See, I have the advantage of having found out how hard it is to get to really know something, how careful you have to be about checking the experiments, how easy it is to make mistakes and fool yourself. I know what it means to know something, and therefore I see how they get their information. And I can't believe that they know it. They haven't done the work necessary, haven't done the checks necessary, haven't done the care necessary. I have a great suspicion that they don't know, that this stuff is, don't know, and they're intimidating people by it.
The absence of governing laws renders a theory vague, predisposing it to confirmation by anything. The ambiguity is compounded when observations themselves are unavailable.
You can always prove any definite theory wrong. Notice, however, we never prove it right. Suppose that you invent a good guess, calculate the consequences, and discover that every consequence that you calculate agrees with experiment. The theory is then right? No, it is simply not proved wrong. Because in the future, there could be a wider range of experiments, you could compute a wider range of consequences, and you may discover then that the thing is wrong. I must also point out to you that you cannot prove a vague theory wrong. If the guess that you make is poorly expressed and rather vague, and the method that you use for figuring out the consequences is rather a little vague, you're not sure, I mean, you say, I think everything's because it's all due to Muggles, and Muggles do this and that more or less, so I can sort of explain how this works. Then you see that that theory is good because it can't be proved wrong. If the process of computing the consequences is indefinite, then with a little skill, any experimental result can be made to look like an expected consequence. You're probably familiar with that in other fields. For example, A hates his mother. The reason is, of course, because she didn't caress him or love him enough when he was a child. Actually, if you investigate, you find out that, as a matter of fact, he did love him very much, and everything was all right. Well, then, it's because she was overindulgent when he was a child. So by having a vague theory, it's possible to get either result. Oh, wait.
Pseudoscience is not how we got to the moon. It is, however, endemic to the climate change industry. We enjoy the benefits of the Age of Enlightenment. which is guided by reason. The instrument of reason is inquiry. We learn by questioning. In real science, understanding is constantly tested. With removal of questioning, the age of enlightenment reverts to an age of fear and superstition. We previously showed that much of the 20th century increase of CO2 can be accounted for by changes of natural emission that depend on temperature. Professor Hardy later showed that when nonlinearity is represented, the same mechanism can account for ancient changes of CO2 in proxy records. Hardy's analysis was not welcomed by the climate change industry. The journal received a criticism by Kohler et al., which sought to undermine Hardy's results. The criticism was little more than a reiteration of the party line, fundamental assumptions relied upon by the IPCC. Hardy then submitted a rebuttal which eviscerated the criticism, along with those assumptions of the IPCC. What happened next will be a landmark in the history of science. The journal published the criticism of Hardy's work, but it censored Hardy's rebuttal, which it refused to publish. To protect the IPCC's assumptions, the climate change industry, under the aegis of the journal and publisher, abandoned the most basic element of due process, along with the bedrock of the age of enlightenment. That reason be informed by all sides of an issue. This is not the first resort to such tactics. It surfaced repeatedly in human history to justify ideology over reason. If you're wondering what they sought to conceal, even from the scientific community, this is your lucky day. Kohler et al. Makes several claims. Claim 1. The residence time of CO2 in the atmosphere differs from its adjustment time, which they claim is well over 100 years. That would be difficult. In the absence of emission, the conservation law for a conserved species like CO2 reduces to a statement that the species' rate of change equals its rate of absorption at the Earth's surface, which is just the inverse of the absorption time times the abundance of CO2. The species must then decay exponentially, with time scale equal to the absorption time. The same law governs a perturbation of CO2, as well as its tracer, carbon-14. Nuclear bomb testing during the 50s and 60s elevated carbon-14. After the perturbing source was removed by the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, carbon-14 decayed exponentially, revealing an absorption time shorter than a decade. As shown previously, the observed decay represents net absorption of C14, inclusive of its re-emission at the Earth's surface. The actual absorption time can be only shorter. In the presence of multiple absorbers, absorption in the physical world proceeds at the collective rate, equal to the sum of the individual absorption rates. It's faster than the absorption rate of the fastest absorber. The rate of change of CO2 then equals the collective absorption rate times overall CO2. The IPCC's treatment of absorption is embodied in the so-called burn model. It differs importantly. There, each absorber is apportioned a designated fraction of overall CO2. A designated fraction to absorber 1, a different fraction to absorber 2, and so forth. Each fraction of CO2 then decays at the absorption rate of the absorber to which it's assigned. Absorption is therefore compartmentalized. Because of this feature, the rate of change of CO2 does not equal the collective absorption rate times overall CO2. Accordingly, this treatment of absorption does not satisfy the conservation law, which is satisfied by CO2 in the atmosphere. The consequence of this failure is pivotal. It's illustrated by a mechanical analog, a pool with multiple drains of different size. In the physical universe, each drain has access to all of the water. So all drains operate in unison. They continue to operate until all of the water has been removed. The collective removal rate is the sum of those of the individual drains. It's faster than that of the fastest drain. The removal time, the time for all water to be removed, is therefore dictated by the fastest drain. In the IPCC universe, absorption is compartmentalized. Individual drains have access to only that water which has been apportioned to them. Overall absorption is therefore staggered. First, water assigned to the fastest drain is emptied. Thereafter, the fastest drain sits idle. Then, water of the next fastest drain is emptied. Thereafter, it too sits idle, until finally, water of the slowest drain has been emptied. Under these conditions, the removal time is dictated by the slowest drain. It's much longer than the removal time of the fastest drain. In fact, one compartment of the burn model has no drain, making the removal time infinite. For CO2, its residence time in the atmosphere equals the time for its removal at the Earth's surface, the time for its absorption there, because that's the only mechanism available for its removal. It's 1 to 2 orders of magnitude shorter than what's relied upon by the IPCC. It's so-called adjustment time, a device likewise cited by Kohler et al. To distinguish the adjustment time, the climate change industry introduces a constant background absorption, A0, in addition to normal absorption, which is proportional to CO2 abundance. This leads to an adjustment time of order 100 years. It's much longer than the residence time of CO2, which is of order a year. This treatment suffers from a minor problem. When atmospheric CO2 vanishes, absorption of CO2 does not. CO2 is removed from the atmosphere, even if there is no CO2 in the atmosphere. What universe this treatment describes is unclear. What is clear is that it is not the physical universe. Were this error committed in a PhD examination at a reputable university, it would result in immediate disqualification. With the species absorption eliminated, the adjustment time reduces to the residence time, which is orders of magnitude shorter. The consequence of this error is transformative. It grossly exaggerates the accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere, which then exceeds 1,000 ppmv. Under the conservation law, CO2 attains levels only a fraction as large. Kohler et al.'s claim 2. The treatment of carbon neglects changes in land, ocean, the biosphere, marine sediments, etc., etc. CO2 in the atmosphere is governed by the three-dimensional form of the conservation law. Averaging over the volume of the atmosphere reduces it to the conservation law for atmospheric mean CO2. What we've been looking at. The anthropogenic perturbation is governed by the same law, with anthropogenic emission and the absorption time specified. The conservation law is entirely determined. So too is anthropogenic CO2, which follows from the conservation law. In light of observed behavior, you've seen what it requires. Changes in extraneous reservoirs, like the ocean, marine sediments, and countless others, are then irrelevant. For those in pursuit of truth, that's fortunate, because those global properties are virtually unobserved. Kohler et al.'s claim 3. Comparisons were against the wrong ice proxy. It's doubtful that any ice proxy of CO2 is correct. We've previously shown that the cross-coherence between ice proxies of CO2 and temperature reveals conditions experienced by ancient ice that were strongly non-conservative, wherein CO2 in ice had been modified from its original form when it left the atmosphere. Associated with irreversible transformations, this behavior differs fundamentally from the cross-coherence of atmospheric CO2 and temperature, behavior that was actually observed in the atmosphere. The non-conservative conditions experienced by ancient ice make ice proxies of CO2 unreliable, fraught with uncertainty. It's for this reason that ice proxy CO2 requires interpretation, processing, which converts measured values into what they should be. Like all proxies, ice proxies of atmospheric CO2 are therefore clouded by ambiguity, a feature which makes them vulnerable to interpretation. What Hardy showed is that the temperature dependence of natural emission, inclusive of nonlinearity, can account for any of the proxy records of ancient CO2. To support the veracity of ice proxy CO2, Kohler et al. Also claim ice core CO2 perfectly overlaps instrumental measurements of atmospheric CO2. Really? In blue are the original measurements of CO2 extracted from ice, which were dated according to the age of surrounding ice. Atmospheric measurements are in green. They don't agree. Well then, it must be because the age of the gas differs from the age of surrounding ice. Take two. The measured values of CO2 were then processed, invoking an ad hoc adjustment. Which shifted their age by 82 years. Just enough to make the end of the ice record coincide with the beginning of the atmospheric record. Sound familiar? The ambiguity of processing is systemic in the climate change industry because it relies not on direct observations, which are the litmus test of any theory, but on proxy data, which invariably are clouded by uncertainty that requires interpretation. Proxies are no substitute for actual observations of atmospheric behavior. Those observations are now long enough to test this theory. You've seen what they require. Feynman succinctly expressed the fundamental principle of science. We search for a new physical law through the following process. First, we guess. Then we perform a calculation to see the consequences of the guess. And then we compare the result directly with observed behavior. If it disagrees, the guess is wrong. In that statement is the key to science. It doesn't matter how beautiful your guess is. It doesn't matter who made the guess or what his name is. If it disagrees with observed behavior, it's wrong. That's all there is to it. The treatment of Hardy's rebuttal sends a chilling message to the scientific community. Those who dare to publish evidence that's unsupportive of the climate change agenda will be roundly criticized in a published comment. When they seek to publish a rebuttal, they will be silenced, prevented from uttering a peep in their defense. Censorship of Hardy's rebuttal, let alone to a defective criticism, will intimidate all but the most committed. It's equivalent to an employer holding misconduct proceedings against an employee whom the employer has sequestered overseas. In today's Australia, that's considered a fair go. Suppression of evidence that falsifies underpinnings of the climate change industry supports a crisis of convenience. It served as a device to fund all manner of irrelevance, which is marketed as science. Climate projections based on prediction of atmospheric CO2, which clearly is not understood. If climate models can't predict CO2, they can hardly predict how future CO2 will influence other properties. The impact of anthropogenic climate change on the brown butterfly, on emotion and morality, on literature and science fiction, on crabs, seaweed, plant sexuality, mud. Yes, mud. And the impact of climate change on the Australian cuckoo. Maintaining this industry requires effective communication to the naive masses, performed under the support of scientific agencies. Communicating climate change, 2.99 million from the National Science Foundation. Climate change education, 5.6 million from the National Science Foundation. Climate in the newsroom, 2.6 million from the National Science Foundation. And last but not least, Climate Change, the musical, sponsored by, you guessed it, the National Science Foundation, to the tune of $700,000, all supported by the public's resources, for its own good, of course. One must wonder if these are the activities of a promoter of scientific understanding or an instrument of social dogma. The real travesty in this affair is what, on the grounds of a contrived crisis, has been ignored. While countless resources are diverted to a crisis of convenience, the real mechanisms, those behind changes of regional climate, have been relegated to the dustbin of ignorance. The distorted narrative on climate is the product of a postmodern universe, a universe in which ideology trumps reason. In this universe, a student of ancient kangaroos or tree rings becomes an expert on the atmosphere. The purveyors of ideology capitalize on it being mass-marketed under the guise of virtue, coupled with unquestioning naivete. Blind deference to ideology, however, has a price. In more ways than one. Implicit in effective communication is suppression of contradictory evidence, while media gatekeepers discriminate information to the party line. If even that proves insufficient, the industry resorts to slander. An organized PR campaign, well funded by vested interests, to subordinate and intimidate dissent. Some examples from those with the temerity to question the party line. WikiLeaks revealed that Legum was misrepresenting my work in a political campaign on behalf of billionaire Tom Steyer, a decade-long effort to destroy my academic career through bullying, politicking, and spreading lies. Roger Pilkey. I've been put under enormous group pressure. I will start to worry about my health and safety. It reminds me of the time of McCarthy. Leonard Bankston. Those still alive are the subject of constant public abuse and libel, leading several, like Bankston and Tenekes, to withdraw from the field.
Richard Lindzen.
And lastly, after I presented my research, Macquarie University notified me, its purported chair of climate, that my role was being altered. You will be assigned to tutoring, marking, and fieldwork in non-climate units. We will be moving you to a situation where your teaching will be to help others. This will be your new teaching role. Yours truly. I notified Macquarie where it could position my new teaching role. The sponsored promotion of ideology, intimidation of dissent, and censorship of contradictory evidence reflect a prophetic insight into how manipulating information can distort the public's perception of reality. Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. Why the climate change industry resorts to these tactics is hardly a mystery. They have to. Were climate gladiators ever to go head-to-head with hard scientists, real scientists with demonstrated capacity in what actually controls the atmosphere, they'd be laughed out of the Colosseum, once and for all. Until then, this festering sore on the public's back will chronically re-emerge with the frequency of the political cycle. There's only one protection against this perversion of science. It's the same protection against the perversion of law and the manipulation of information by media. Ensure that both sides are represented. Where that protection is circumvented is not science, nor any legitimate process, because it blocks the avenue to truth. The importance of this safeguard was illustrated by the Challenger disaster, when the space shuttle exploded on launch. That failure jeopardized NASA's multi-billion-dollar shuttle program. The mystery was eventually solved because NASA was forced to open the discussion. It yielded a robust scientific exchange, unbridled by vested interests. The mystery was solved by an outsider. A critical component of the shuttle had been defended in claims by government experts. Those claims were falsified. By Feynman. The shuttle program wasn't saved by government experts. It was saved by one who challenged those experts. The promoted view of atmospheric CO2, the foundation of the climate change industry, is the product of a universe in which atmospheric CO2 changes only through human emission, but a few percent of natural emission, which is presumed to be asleep. A universe in which isotopic changes that are inherent to natural emission of CO2 are portrayed as a signature of human emission. A universe in which CO2 is removed from the atmosphere, even if there's no CO2 in the atmosphere. And most unsettling, a universe in which observed behavior that falsifies tenets of the climate change industry is verboten, silenced, and systematically expunged from the record. In this universe, only one side is permitted, the party line. The consequence of this last feature is transparent. It conceals fundamental errors of this fantasy universe. This universe is not governed by the laws of physics or any hard science. It's governed by ideology. The end justifies the means. The failure of institutionalized science to treat this subject objectively, how science must be done, will be an indelible blight on the credibility of science. Under postmodern leadership and its pursuit of cash and influence, the very institutions who are supposed to advance science, not through political gain, but through understanding of the natural world, will have shot science in the foot. Why they gravitated to this state isn't difficult to understand. A society which supports only one side of a divisive issue shall have only one side.